All right, so when we last left off, in the last section, we looked at how World War II affected the American home front and the people that were not actually off fighting. When we left off with the fighting, we left off with the Allies had successfully driven the Germans out of North Africa. The German army had been surrounded and destroyed at Stalingrad, so the war for the Germans had definitely taken a turn for the worse. In the Pacific, we actually just got to Midway 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and we said that now the Japanese are going to start to get driven back. So let's look at that. After having successfully invaded North Africa in 1942, as we said, November of 1942, Operation Torch, the first Allied landings, and then we talked about the eventual defeat of Rommel. In early 1943, Franklin Roosevelt went to Casablanca in Morocco to meet with Winston Churchill to talk about the next step. It's called the Casablanca Conference. It was really a meeting, as you can see up there, to kind of outline our strategy going forward for the next bit. We have successfully done our first step, which was basically get American troops in the fight. Now what do we do? At this meeting, two major things were agreed to. One, that we would step up the strategic bombing of Germany and the Axis in general. And we're going to talk more about that here in a couple minutes. But they basically committed to a long-term campaign to bomb the industrial capability of the Nazis and her allies out of existence. And secondly, we agreed to attack what Winston Churchill loved to call the soft underbelly, Italy. That is who and where it is. The soft underbelly of the Axis is Italy. That was considered the weak point of the Axis. If you look at the history of World War II, and you start to look at numbers and such, Italy is definitely the sidekick to Nazi Germany, and it's not the best sidekick you could have had. The Italians had struggled to have success fighting in Africa to gain colonies in the interwar period. During World War II, the Italian army struggled many times, and not because of a lack of courage on the part of the Italians or ability. That wasn't always the case. They were not as industrialized. Their economy was not as strong as Germany's. They didn't always have the best of equipment. So everybody could tell that they were not the major. And then you start to think of the other stuff. Italy didn't blitzkrieg people. Italy did not conquer all these other countries. And so Winston Churchill was pretty convinced you could knock Italy out of the war pretty easily, pretty quickly. So that became the next step. It also makes sense if you think about it. Having taken control of North Africa, it isn't that far across the Mediterranean to Sicily, the island that the Italian boot looks to be kicking, and then from there you can invade mainland Italy. And there was hope that this would be like a back door, that this would be an easy invasion route into Nazi Germany, because again, the Italians would fold, and then you could kind of drive into Germany without having to somehow cook up some massive invasion across the English Channel into France or something. And so, I said again, we will get back to this bombing campaign. Let's talk about Italy first. In July of 1943, we invaded Sicily, which is part of Italy. First major use of American paratroopers. There had been a few paratroopers used in North Africa, but there were a lot more of them used in Sicily, and then we landed on the island of Sicily. We were able to drive the German and Italian defenders off of Sicily by August 18th. We had control of the entire island of Sicily, so it took us about a month. We started on July 10th, and we took control of it on August 18th. The attack on Sicily created a major crisis for the Italian government, I will say. The King of Italy, who, theoretically, legally speaking, is in charge of Italy, is the head of state. I realize that Mussolini, who had been serving as prime minister and all sorts of other things, was running the show. But if you really want to get down to it, it was one of those systems where there still is a monarch on paper. For the king of Italy, there was a crisis, and they were not really eager to be the recipients of this attack. And so Italian generals and the king got together and agreed it was time for Mussolini to go. On July 25th, 1943, the king had the dictator come to the palace, and as your book said, he told him, "My dear Duce, it is no longer any good. Italy has gone to bits. The soldiers don't want to fight anymore." The king placed Mussolini under arrest, and the Italian government began secretly contacting the Allies for help. Well, to surrender, I should say. On September 18th, 1943, the Italian government announced Italy's surrender. Sort of a surprise to the Germans, not a complete surprise. I know the Italians are trying to be secretive, but the Nazis were really good at finding out secrets. They were somewhat aware what the Italian government was up to. Hitler was not happy, but he wasn't going to just roll over. Okay, just because Italy surrendered doesn't mean the Germans aren't going to fight to defend the soil that they are on. And so while the Italians might have flipped sides, and they did, the Germans said no, and they dug in. Italy is perfect for fighting the defensive war, if you think about it. If you look at the map, which I think I have one, well, this isn't a good one because it's hard to tell, but Italy is basically a peninsula with a mountain chain running down its back. Okay? You have the Apennine Mountains. So if you are the Allies trying to drive your way into Italy, all right, time for a really bad illustration. So we'll actually make Italy a boot. There. Okay? And the middle of it is mountains. All right? And it's really hard to fight your way through mountains. So if you're the Allies, your only choices are these thin areas along the coast, which means the Germans, first of all, Italy's not that wide to begin with. So the Germans basically just draw a line and hold it, you know, and you're going to have to fight and slog your way through. And when you break through, it's like trench warfare. The Germans, have another line and another line. And they just keep doing this the whole way up the peninsula. And so it is not an easy road into the heart of Germany. Your book mentioned how there was the town of Cassino. It took the Allies, in Anzio, not too far away. The Allies kept basically having to do invasions. If you look it up, so the Germans had a line here. The Allies couldn't break through, so the Allies have to do a landing here and get behind the Germans, force them to retreat. They can't get through this line, another invasion. And basically we kept having to re-invade Italy, like every few months, a little further up the peninsula than we started. Cassino and Anzio, it took 5 months. It took 5 months to break the deadlock. In late 1944, the Germans were finally in late May of 1944, the Germans were finally forced to retreat from Anzio and Cassino. But they dug in front of Rome. It took another 2 weeks to take Rome. The Allies finally captured Rome. Most people don't know this. We didn't capture Rome until after D-Day. We had invaded France at D-Day before we captured Rome. We had invaded Italy a year earlier. So we had troops in Italy in August of 1943. And we didn't make it to Rome until June of 1944. Italy did not turn into the gateway to Nazi Germany we had hoped it had been. The Allies lost over 300,000 casualties fighting in Italy. When the war ended in May of 1945, we were still in Italy. We had not driven all the way through Italy. There were still Germans holding on to the mountainous regions of northern Italy. So this was not as soft. Italy was the soft underbelly, but the terrain of Italy was perfect for the Germans to defend. Now, let's go back to that other thing we talked about at Casablanca, the bombing strategy. And here, if you're curious, it goes this, right? So you can see July, before the invasions, In November, we had taken, Sardinia and Corsica and Sicily in the southern portion of the Italian boot. Rome is up here. We're still not even to there. You can see by July we had taken Rome, so a little more progress. By this point, you can see we have invaded northern France and southern France, which we're going to start talking about here in a few moments. So by September of 1944, American troops in France are actually knocking on the border of Germany, and the troops in Italy still have got miles upon miles to go before they even get to Austria. So you can see by December of 1944, when the British and the Americans are about to enter Germany, again, northern Italy still has not surrendered in large part, and when the war ends in May, and basically Germany has been conquered, we're still not through Italy. But back to that bombing. I'm going to show you some facts and figures and charts and whatnot. We started bombing Nazi Germany before Casablanca. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, as your book mentioned, dropped an average of 2,300 tons every month on Nazi Germany. That was the monthly average over a 3-year span before the United States at the Casablanca Conference committed to really getting in on this. The United States 8th Air Force, based out of England, joined the campaign and began dropping another 1,500 tons of bombs every month on average. Well, excuse me, they dropped 1,500 tons by the end of the year. And then the following year, when they had fully committed to the bombing effort, you can see over that whole year, 44,000 tons. Between 1943 and 1945, the RAF and the United States 8th Air Force dropped an average of 53,000 tons on Nazi Germany every month. If you add up all of these numbers and you divide the amount of time that we were bombing, we averaged 53,000 tons of explosives every month on Germany, which, as you can see, is more than all of Bomber Command, had dropped in any one of the preceding years. It's very impressive. You've got up here, the number of sorties flown. By the way, sortie means one plane, one mission. So if a plane over the period of a month flies 10 missions, it's flown 10 sorties. You can see the number of aircraft lost. Here you go. Here's all kinds of statistics. It's quite impressive if you really dig into the history of it. It was an enormous campaign. It was 24 hours a day. The United States Air Force flew the daytime raids. The British Air Force flew the nighttime raids. Okay. So most of this by the RAF was done at night. We volunteered to take the daytime flying because the daytime flying is far more dangerous. That's why you can see the British, a lot of night sorties, not as many day sorties because they specialized in the night missions. We flew the daytime missions. You can see how many fighter missions were flown, how many aircraft were destroyed, how many men were lost, etc. The major takeaway is, while it was immensely destructive, and it made life very difficult for the Nazis, they were constantly having to take time and effort, manpower and resources to repair railroad lines, factories, pipelines, communication lines, all sorts of stuff. We did create traffic problems. We created delivery problems. We helped contribute to an oil shortage. Your book mentions that we did cause a severe oil shortage. I don't know if that's 100% true, because doing some research on it, Nazi Germany's oil basically fell off when Romania was invaded by the Russians, and Romania had been the major oil producer for the Nazis. But regardless, it did make life difficult, but it didn't break them. Their industrial output continued to rise. They moved factories into the forests. They moved them into the mountains. Then the Allies at the end of the war discovered German factories that were basically constructed in caves and tunnels in the mountains. The Germans continued to produce things. It's just we made it more difficult and slowed their production rate down, which did make it very difficult for their Air Force to recover and repair itself. It got to the point that basically the Luftwaffe wasn't even a factor. But we weren't able to bomb our way to victory, and that's the key thing I'm trying to emphasize. At the start of World War II, there were a lot of people in the Air Forces of the various countries, convinced that bomber technology and bombers and bombing had advanced so much that you could win a war with just bombs. And, there was no way to stop all these bombers and such. The slogan was, the bomber will always get through. And as we saw in World War II, cities became targets, civilians, everything was on the table. Turns out that's not what won the war. That helped win the war. But what won the war was a bunch of guys with rifles and tanks and such conquering enemy territory. We bombed the Germans brutally. They did not surrender until Berlin fell. We bombed the Japanese mercilessly, as we will talk about eventually. They did eventually surrender, and everybody says it's because of bombing solely, but as I will teach you, there's a little more to it. So unfortunately, the bombing effort did not win the war by itself. You still had to send men into the heat of combat to try and get it done. When it became clear that we were going to have to invade France, that this idea that we've been kind of sort of cooking around for a while was going to become a reality, because again, the back door of Italy was not the back door that we thought it was, and it became very obvious that we were going to need to do something up here. It was decided that we needed to have a meeting before we did that. And so in 1943, Stalin, who Roosevelt wanted to meet before we did all of this, Joseph Stalin agreed to a meeting, and the Big Three, as they're called, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, all got together and met in the city of Tehran, Iran, in what we call the Tehran Conference. The leaders wanted to hash out a few details and a few things. And again, it was more like an overall strategic meeting. Some of the things they agreed to, first of all, to help make sure that the invasion of France, which I'll just call D-Day for the sake of space, to help assure that D-Day would be successful, the Soviets promised that they would launch a massive offensive on the Germans right before D-Day was scheduled to take place to draw the German army away from Normandy. Basically, the Germans would be busy, and that would give us a better chance when we invaded France. I think I mentioned in one of my previous videos, over 80-something% of the German army was engaged in fighting the Soviets on the Eastern Front the day that D-Day took place, well over 80%. And so we were only facing a small fraction of the Nazis that we might have had to have faced had it not been for them doing that. The second agreement was that at the end of the Second World War, Germany would be divided. She would be broken up, something that Woodrow Wilson had fought to prevent at the end of World War I. We had now decided that, yes, twice in really one generation was unacceptable, and Nazi Germany at the end of this would be divided amongst the great powers. How, we weren't sure, but we all agreed that a division would take place to assure that a large Germany would not remain after this war. And finally, the Soviets promised that they would join the war against Japan after Nazi Germany had surrendered. Many people didn't realize it. The Soviets and the Japanese awkwardly stared at each other but never went to war, even though Japan was at war with us, Russia's ally, against Nazi Germany. Both sides had basically come to the conclusion that it was in their best interest to focus on their respective wars and kind of leave each other alone. But the Soviets made it clear that once the war in Europe was over, they would join the war in the Pacific. Also, smaller tidbit, Joseph Stalin agreed to the creation of a new international organization that would try and promote peace and prevent war in the future, like a League of Nations 2.0, an organization that would eventually become the United Nations, but we're not there yet. Now, we have been talking about D-Day, so let's get to it. The real name for the invasion of France is Operation Overlord. That is really the name for the Normandy, the entire operation to invade northern France, the Normandy region of France, is called Operation Overlord. It was a project planned and organized and under the command of Dwight Eisenhower, future president of the United States. There had actually been a discussion as to who should be in charge of this one, and the president originally wanted General John Marshall, or George Marshall, excuse me. John Marshall is a Supreme Court judge. George Marshall, but they decided George Marshall was too important at the War Department, so they put Dwight Eisenhower in charge of it. Everybody calls it D-Day. First of all, every major military operation has a D-Day. It has an H-hour. H-hour is when the operation starts, the time it starts. D-Day is the day that it starts. The D stands for nothing. Where these come from, I can't really explain, except the military decided that a nice shorthand way of basically just being able to say, what is the date of this or what is the time of this is to refer to things as D-Day and H-hour. So the D-Day and D stands for nothing. There were a lot of D-Days. Every major operation has a D-Day attached to it. The reason I would say that everybody remembers Overlord as D-Day and calls it D-Day is it was the biggest invasion in history. It was the largest amphibious invasion in the history of the world that we are aware of. And many people saw it as kind of like the final step in the end to Nazi Germany. But anyhow, the real name is Operation Overlord. This was a humongous undertaking. First of all, so many things had to go right? I usually, when we have this in class, I try and come up with a good metaphor, and I always struggle. The easiest one off the hand or off the top of my head is just trying to thread the eye of a needle in the dark in a really windy storm. I mean, so many things had to go right, and one little mistake, and it's over. And so the Allies faced an incredibly challenging and incredibly daunting task to get all these things to line up. The first thing that had to be established is where. Before I even get to the weather and timing, where are we going? Well, it turns out we are not going to go to the most narrow part of the English Channel. It'd be easier if I just I want to have a map. Here we go. So, the most narrow part of the English Channel is right here. Okay, can we do this one? Yeah, we can do this one. Okay, right here. That is called the Pas-De-Calais. That is the thinnest part of the English Channel, and it was assumed by the Nazis that that's where we were going to go. And so they really beefed up the defenses there. They were ready for an invasion there. We wanted to go ahead and play along with that because we really wanted to go here, okay, over here, Normandy, France. It's a longer distance across the English Channel, but it seemed like the better option for us. There are several issues that go into that, but there's a major seaport that's nearby that we could use for resupply. It was less heavily defended than the Pas-De-Calais, obviously. There's also an issue with the beaches and the soil and being able to take certain equipment, things of that nature. It just worked out. And so our goal was to aim for Normandy, not the Pas-De-Calais. So first things first, we chose that spot. Secondly, we got to get the Germans to buy into the fact that we're not going to that we're going to Pas-De-Calais, even though we're not. But we'll get there in a moment. Now, weather and timing are everything. Okay, we are going to need to do this at night. We need to do this at night for several reasons. One, we're sending in paratroopers several hours before the invasion. We need those planes to drop those paratroopers at night. Because we don't want the planes to be in the daylight where they can be easily shot down and the paratroopers easily seen and easily attacked. So we need to drop the paratroopers at night. We also need the cover of darkness to give the ships as much time as possible to go across the English Channel and get in position and start unloading troops before daylight happens. But we need a night with a full moon. I know that seems a little counterintuitive, but we're dropping paratroopers in darkness. And it's something we did in Sicily. We did it when we invaded Sicily. It was called Operation Husky. And we found that dropping paratroopers in nighttime without any moonlight was bad because the paratroopers need some sort of light to, first of all, help them successfully land, and secondly, to help them at least do something. They're going to have to get their gear. They're going to have to be able to rally and stuff, and we don't need them turned on flashlights. They can't. So we need it to be a night with a full moon. All right? And if you think that's ridiculous, next time we have a good full moon night, and it's clear, go out during the night. And it amazingly provides a good amount of light for you to operate from. So that tells us we only have a few windows, right? Because the full moon only occurs, truly one day every 28 days, but you really only have good full moon conditions several days every month, okay? Now, we also are going to have to do this to where a full moon night coincides with a low tide the next morning. I'm going to get to the tide here in a minute. I'll show you why. But we need a low tide, not a high tide. I know everybody wants a high tide. Get as close as you know. Low tide. So we have very specific moon conditions. We're going to need certain tide conditions. We obviously need clear weather. We can't drop paratroopers in a storm. We can't send invasion, groups over the Atlantic Ocean, over the English Channel during a storm. So we've got a very specific circumstance we need. That only occurred. There was one in early June. There wasn't another one until several weeks in later. By that point, you'd be in July, if I remember correctly. From then, we only have basically like 4 or 5 opportunities to do this in 1944. And remember, the Nazis are fighting the Soviets. We can't do this forever because the Russians are basically planning on we're going to join and invade. They're launching their invasion based on a promise that we would do this. Secrecy's key. We're going to Normandy. If the Nazis find out that we're lying, we're in trouble because we're banking on they're not defending Normandy. How did we try and convince them that we were going to the Pas-De-Calais? We built fake armies. We built training camps near the Pas-De-Calais. We ran training operations on the coast of England in areas that resembled the Pas-De-Calais geographically. We sent all kinds of reconnaissance flights over the Pas-De-Calais. We did all sorts of stuff that would make you think that we were going there. We even created a fake army. We created a fake, on paper, army with headquarters. General Patton was in charge of it. The Germans assumed that General Patton would be the man leading the invasion of northern France. Turns out General Patton was actually, he was serving a suspension. He was in timeout. He got in trouble for slapping a soldier suffering from PTSD in a hospital in Italy. It was big to do in the papers. And so the Germans didn't know it, but our best general was, he was serving in school suspension, so to speak. But we said that, no, he's in charge of the invasion. We're going to Pas-De-Calais. We had all these army camps. We had all this paperwork. We actually had fake trucks and tanks and everything. It's amazing. We actually made inflatable tanks. BF Goodrich, they made these big inflatable tanks. Now I know some of you are like, that's ridiculous. From a distance, it looks like a real tank. And the idea was if there was a German spy in England, they're not going to get inside the army camp. They're going to watch the camp from a hill, overlooking it. And so these things were designed to where 1 or 2 guys could get inside of it, and there were handles, and they could just pick it up and move it. And that way it would look like these tanks were moving on a regular basis, and you wouldn't actually need to waste gas and everything moving real tanks. You wouldn't be wasting real tanks. So yeah, it was an elaborate ruse. Another thing we did is we had a plane crash. We faked the plane crash, and we purposely had a dead body, a real, actual dead soldier, a body that we saved. We had it with special documents, like battle plans. We purposely had it wash up on the shore for the Germans to find. So it would look like the Germans had magically discovered our battle plan to invade the Pas-De-Calais. So it was very elaborate. We tried to create a swimming tank. It was called the dual drive Sherman. We were trying to design a way to get a tank on the beach to help support the early invasion wave. We built the tank, but they failed miserably because the day we actually invaded, which was June 6th, the weather was far too choppy, and their waves were too high, and the tanks foundered. They basically began to take on water because the waves came over the top. It was a great idea, but it failed. And I have up here logistics. You know, between 1943 and the actual invasion in the summer of 1944, we had put 1.5 million men in England. We had put 12,000 aircraft, 5 million tons of supplies, hundreds of invasion craft. All of this waiting for this invasion. It's a massive undertaking. I mean, we basically were moving a massive chunk of the American army to England so that it could then move to France in a matter of a few days. And again, remember, guys, we have to do all of this before email, before internet. No mobile phones, or cell phones. You have a lot of stuff that has to be done old school, using the mail and runners, and you actually really were cautious about using telephone lines because it's hard to have a secure telephone line back then and things of that nature. So it's quite impressive when you think about it. Finally, we got to our first window. The weather was awful. We actually had to cancel the first day, June 5th. We had to push it back 24 hours. It looks like June 6th, it's not going to be any better. There's a famous story where Eisenhower was meeting with his weatherman, and his one weatherman said, "I would go for it, sir." And he basically went on a hunch. Even today, with modern science, with satellites and everything, predicting the weather in this part of the world is about 50-50. They no kidding, are about 50-50. It's a very volatile region, meteorologically. Yeah, that's how you say that. So this guy went on a hunch, and he said, "I think we'll have a clearing. Let's go." And so late on June 5th, the early morning hours of June 6th, the aircraft took off. The paratroopers started jumping out during the middle of the night and started, doing what they were supposed to be doing to prepare. Everybody started sailing. And on the morning hours of June 6th, we started hitting the beaches of Normandy. There were 5 invasion beaches. They were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Sword, Juno. There were British, American, and Canadian troops on this invasion. In general, to the east, the British and Canadians had a good time. Their beaches were lightly defended. They took very few casualties. They captured most of their objectives. They actually had a very large hold of territory. The Americans who landed to the west on Utah and Omaha found a different story. Utah wasn't as bad. Omaha, though, was a bit of a slaughter. Omaha Beach was far more heavily defended than we anticipated. It just turned out a crack unit was trying to recover from fighting against the Russians there. Now, I mentioned we wanted to go in at low tide. Okay, first of all, this is the actual beach. This is where the landings at Omaha Beach took place. Okay, so this is the real Omaha Beach landing site. You can see that basically you've got beach, and then there is this, it kind of leads up to this little incline right here. This is called the shingle. You can't tell it from this range, I should say. These are pebbles or rocks, okay? So this is called the shingle. And then you get to this wall, okay, which leads up to the shelf, which then leads to the cliffs, okay? And so this is what they were facing. Basically, now, some of you are like, I would want high tide to get me as close to the shingle as I can, because when it's high tide, the boats would have landed here. At low tide, the boats are going to land out here. And the Germans are all up here. And I mean, you're basically making your men go over several hundred yards of open beach if you go in at low tide. Why did they go in at low tide? Because the Germans had put obstacles in the water. Okay? Far out, there was a line of what are called Belgian gates. And on top of them were mines. And then they had some sticks with mines. And then they had these X-looking obstacles a little closer in. And basically all this stuff was out there to make it to where landing craft would either blow up or they would get trapped or whatever. And so we had to go in at low tide. So first of all, if any of these were far out, the men driving the landing craft could see them. And also, we just wanted to unload the men before we got to any of that stuff so that all the men possible would hit the beach. So your men are going to have to cross a lot of land, and that's, again, why we had to go in at low tide. It exposes them to more enemy fire, but at high tide, many, many landing craft would be destroyed by all these different obstacles and hidden booby traps, so to speak. Omaha Beach, this is a picture taken from one of the landing craft. You can see, if you look at this picture, you can see some of the, here you go. Here's some of those crisscross obstacles right there, okay, that I was talking about. You can see, obviously, the hills off in the distance and the mist. The men some of them would be lucky enough the boat would get all the way up to the beach, but obviously some of them ran into a sandbar or something and unloaded in waist deep water or whatever. There was a photographer, a combat photographer. There are some people. They were a lot more common actually back in World War II. Guys, that's what their job was. Their job was to take pictures and film stuff in actual combat. A guy by the name of Robert Capa. He was in the first wave at Omaha Beach, and he took a bunch of photos. Unfortunately, the kid back in England, after it was all said and done, developing his photos, and I say kid, it was, a teenager, 20-something-year-old, he turned up the heat too high in the development room and melted many of the photos. Only 8 of the 106 pictures that Robert Capa took of the initial invasion survived. But this guy, he waded ashore with the men at Normandy and took a few photos, like this one of a guy. He's actually crawling. He's not swimming. You can see in the background, though. You see that stick pointing upwards, and it's got some poles supporting it. If a landing craft ran into this, it would kind of ride up it and flip over, right? Tip over. Or there might be a mine on the top of it, and it would blow them up, right? So that's an example of some of those obstacles. As I said, again, you can see some of these. So these were in the water, and that's why we had to go in at low tide, because otherwise a landing craft would either get trapped or blow up or whatever. But again, here's another photo he took. Here's some of the British paratroopers actually getting ready before they load up. They're synchronizing their watches, making sure that they've got the right time on their watch, because some of their objectives were time-based. Speaking of the paratroopers, by the way, there's a great series about paratroopers in World War II. Came out in the early 2000s. It's called Band of Brothers. I actually know when it came out because one of the episodes was delayed because it was supposed to be broadcast the night of September 11th, and obviously nothing was on TV that night. But it's almost 20 years old now, but it's incredibly realistic. There was much effort to try and get it as accurate as they could. It tells the story of men in the 101st Airborne, and it does involve D-Day, because the D-Day invasion was the first it was the combat debut, if you will, of the 101st Airborne. Also, I don't have it up here. If you are looking for a very accurate portrayal of the Normandy invasion, I highly recommend Saving Private Ryan. The first 30 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, a film which came out in the late 90s, I believe 1997 maybe? Yeah, 1997 sounds right, maybe 98. Starring Tom Hanks. He doesn't make bad movies. It is roundly agreed upon. It is the most accurate portrayal of Omaha Beach ever made. They went to great length to get the detail right. They even showed it to survivors of Omaha Beach. Again, this was 20 years ago. There were a lot more men who were at D-Day alive back then to actually screen it and view it. Many of them said, yep, that was it. So if you would like to know what it was like to be there on that day and go through that experience, you can watch that. It is very gruesome and very realistic. Little disclaimer. But anyhow, we were successful. It was a near-run thing, but by the end of the day, the end of that first day, gentlemen, 75,000 British and Canadian troops were ashore. By the end of the day, 35,000 American troops had made it onto Omaha. Another 23,000 were in Utah. So by the end of the day, we had an enormous amount of manpower on the beach. Well over 120,000 men had made it ashore. We had a small sliver of land. We were holding on. And the invasion would go on from there. Now let's jump over to the Pacific War a little bit, okay? Okay. In the Pacific, the plan was just basically two paths. There are a bunch of small island archipelagos in the Central Pacific, little collections. There's the Gilbert Islands, there's the Marshall Islands, there's, what am I wanting to say, the Mariana Islands. So there are a bunch of small island chains that you could work your way up. The Navy and Marines were going to focus on going that way. And the idea is they would start driving their way towards the Philippines and Japan through that path. Further south, you have island chains as well, but they tend to be larger in size and more substantial. You have the Solomon Islands and New Guinea and such. The plan was for Douglas MacArthur and the Army, with a few Marines helping, to drive through the Southern Pacific. And the theory is we would approach Japan from those two directions. Eventually, MacArthur would swing on through, take the Philippines, and we would then be able to be in a position to invade Japan at that point. Okay, so it's kind of a two-pronged attack. Now, I have up circled island hopping, and that's a big part of the story. We were going to practice what is called island hopping. And what does that mean? Okay, so you've got your chain of islands. Okay, let's make an island chain. Some are bigger than others, some are smaller. I don't care. It's not important here. Just so you guys don't. There. Okay? You don't have to capture every single island. If this island has an airfield on it, okay, and we need that airfield, we take that airfield. Okay? We ignore these. We can skip these. Not important. Okay? We take that one. All right? Now, let's say there's another island chain not too far away. We might want to take this one because obviously with it being the closest one to the next island chain we're headed for, we want to use it as a base. We'll take this one. That's it. We skip these. We hop. We hop from this one to this one. We don't need to take every island. But aren't there Japanese troops on these islands, sir? Yes, there are. And they can't do anything. They're stuck. As long as we make sure our Navy prevents the Japanese Navy from rescuing them and picking them up, they're just going to sit there and starve. And so you don't take every single island in the Pacific. There are literally thousands of islands. You don't need to invade thousands of islands. You just take the ones you need. You take the ones that are important, either to us or you take the ones that are important to the enemy to deny them to the enemy. And so that's what we're going to do in the Pacific. We're going to slowly hop our way across. Now, this shows you all 78 amphibious operations that we did in the Pacific in World War II. That's right, 78 of them. Some of them, of course, are tied together or were part of the same operation. But 78 times the Army or the Marines loaded up and went to beaches and attacked. And as you can see, again, the Navy and the Marines were primarily doing this one, okay? So they were driving up in this direction, okay? Meanwhile, Douglas MacArthur and the Army, they were doing this one. The Marines helped. And then, of course, both groups met up here because that was the next stop. And then from here, the goal was to go to Japan, all right? So that gives you a better view of it because you can actually see the invasions that were going to take place. Now, and here you go, just on a plain old map. Okay, so again, the Navy and the Marines driving through the Central Pacific, the Army, and some Marines through the South. Okay, now, let's look at what the Navy and Marines did a little first. The first step for the Navy and the Marines was a small island called Tarawa, which was to be invaded in November of 1943. It's in the Gilbert Island chain, which ties into the Marshall Islands, which ties to the Carolina, which ties to the Mariana, right? Tarawa is actually an atoll, which means it's a string of islands that kind of all are surrounded by a coral reef. All right, and that is going to be one of the biggest problems facing us in the Pacific. When you invaded Normandy, France, we'll go ahead and go back a few. Okay, when you invaded Normandy, France, there's nothing out here. Okay, there's nothing. You go until you run into beach, and then you're done. You hit the beach. You're there. Okay. In the Pacific, your islands are surrounded by coral reefs a lot of times. They are actually coral atoll islands. Here's an actual picture from our friend Google Earth. You can see it out there, okay? You can see the reef and how it's going to come up really close to the water line. Same thing over here. This is a photo taken by the U.S. Army Air Corps. Actually, I think it was the Navy. Right before the invasion. So this is really from 1943. There was an airstrip in the middle. That's why it looks like the island's cut in half. This is just like dirt, gravel, whatever. So it's white. But you can see how it surrounds the islands, right? And so that was one of the problems we're going to face. Tarawa is an atoll, so it's a string of islands. Almost all of the Japanese were on the one island over here in the southwest corner. Okay, Badio. And so that was really where we were focused. We call it the Battle for Tarawa, or we call it Tarawa, but really it was just this little chunk of Tarawa. We did invade all of these islands to make sure there weren't Japanese on them, but this was where all the fighting took place. It's very small. It's very narrow. It's really not that long. But it's going to be the scene of some incredibly intense fighting. One of the things we found out at Tarawa, talking about lessons learned, most of the troops went in on one of these. It's called a Higgins Boat. It is your typical landing craft, right? It's a boat designed to ride in 4 feet of water. Really, the front end is out of the water, and the idea is it'll ride up onto the sand. The propeller is protected from the sand, so you ride up, and then once you drop your troops off, you back up, you go get more. It's what we used at D-Day. Matter of fact, this picture. Okay, going back, these are men running out the front of a Higgins boat. There you go. That's what it looked like. It's very simple. Basically, it's a barge with a door on the front. Okay? So we had used these in places like Sicily. We had used them. We practiced a bunch with them. Everybody was familiar with them, and so we brought them to the Pacific. The problem is they need 4 feet of water. If you get into something less than 4 feet of water, that back part of the Higgins boat is going to get stuck. Interesting fact, and I've mentioned it previously, my maternal grandmother worked at the factory outside of New Orleans where they built those boats. That is what she did in World War II as a woman ordnance worker. She produced invasion craft for World War II. But anyhow, we brought these boats and they got stuck. We were calculating 5 feet of water over the reef. It just so happened, a freak occurrence, we had a neap tide, that's the term for it. There was only 3 feet of water over the reef. The boats ran into the reef. Okay, our landing craft did not make it to the beach. Many of our landing craft got stuck here. And now our men are going to have to work their way through 3 feet of water to get to the beach, and it's going to be quite the distance. Some Marines made it to the beach, a handful, because they were in the new Amtrak, which is basically a boat that has tracks on it, like a tank. It was a vehicle that had been tested, and they were starting to produce them. They weren't widely used yet. We weren't sure, how they would work. So this was their combat debut. They'd never been in combat yet. It had been invented and used in the swamps and the bayous of the southern United States previously to rescue people, actually. And so the Marines were like, we'll try that. Some of them were used at Tarawa, and here's a picture of one in testing. These are ones actually at Tarawa. These were able to drive right over the reef and get the men up to the beach. But most of them were not available. Most troops didn't use them. They got stuck in these. Tarawa was a bloodbath. The Japanese were dug in, ready to fight to the last man, and they did. And these are actual pictures from the beach at Tarawa. These are actually during the fighting. This is the aftermath. These are men during the fighting. Another combat photographer took a picture. There is an actual dead Marine right there. a wounded one being cared for. The guys that were there taking pictures and films, they actually made a film afterwards called With the Marines at Tarawa, and they wanted to release it to the public as a, I don't want to say a propaganda film, but as a way to motivate people to, buy war bonds, support the war, basically to show the sacrifice of our men in the Pacific and what they were facing in the Pacific. And of course, the Army and the Marines were horrified because of these images. We were going to show the American people dead American soldiers lining the beaches. And there was great concern that it would be bad for morale and people weren't ready for it. Franklin Roosevelt personally watched the film and he personally gave it the okay. He said he wanted it released. The American people needed to know what our boys were doing and what their sons were going through. And so the film was released. So these are images that actually are from that film. Over 1,000 Americans were lost taking this small island of Tarawa. All the Japanese there were killed, except for, if I remember, 17. If I remember, or maybe 19. It's either 17 or 19 Japanese soldiers surrendered and or were captured out of several thousand. They fought to the last man. Some of them died in useless bonsai charges or suicide attacks near the end. It took several days. But the American people were horrified to find out that we lost 1,000 men taking this small, what seemed to be insignificant scrap in the Pacific. And of course, that was the big issue, if you think about it. If you start doing the math, and you think of the square mileage, which I don't have it off the top of my head, but if you do the math, and you calculate how many Marines were killed for each square mile of ground that they took, and then you start to think of how many square miles we're going to have to take to get this thing done, that's when the American people freaked out, because they thought we are going to lose an insane number of men in this island hopping campaign. So it did rattle the American public, the casualties at Tarawa. But lessons were learned. We need more Amtracks. We need a better way to get men to the shore instead of letting them get trapped on the coral reefs. And we applied that to the future invasions. When we went to the Marshall Islands, okay, we had more of those Amtracks. And they were actually called alligators by the men. So we had more of those. And then when we went on to take, Kwajalein, which was the major reef island in the Marshall Islands, we had far fewer casualties per square mile. And then we made our way over, and later in 1944, we made our way over to the Mariana Islands, this island chain right here. And again, we had more Amtracks. We still had Higgins boats, but we understood we had to be able to get more men ashore without worrying about coral reef. The Mariana Islands were critical because the Mariana Islands are within B-29 bomber range. We will talk more about the B-29 coming up when we get to Section 5. I misspoke one of my first years teaching this course when I talked about the atomic bomb project, and I said that it was the most expensive project of World War II. I was wrong. The most expensive project of World War II undertaken by your government was the design and development of the B-29. This bomber had a longer range than any other bomber in the world in World War II. It could fly from these islands all the way to Tokyo and back with a heavy bomb load. And so taking these islands was critical because it would open the door to us bombing the Japanese just like we were bombing the Germans, bombing their cities and factories round the clock, right? And so as you can see, in the summer of 1944, we took the islands of the Marianas. We almost immediately began building bases there, and we were able to start bombing the Japanese islands again, only this time with heavy bombers carrying heavy bomb loads, day after day, by late 1944. Going back to the Army and their campaign, and before I forget, if you are interested in the war in the Pacific, there is another outstanding series produced by the people at HBO. This one is about 10 years old. It's like Band of Brothers. It is 8 episodes. Band of Brothers was 10. This one is 8 episodes. It follows a group of Marines. Actually, it's not one group. It kind of has 2 or 3 groups of Marines it has to follow. But it follows Marines throughout the war in the Pacific, from the very beginning of the war all the way to its end. It's called the Pacific. It is very gruesome. It is very grisly and very realistic. There's a lot of horrible stuff in it, so just be aware. It is not PG-13. It is an attempt, again, to show you what these men went through. So if you're interested in that, that is something you could consider. Now, back to the Army. Sorry. As we said, MacArthur and the Army, again, with some Marines helping, they are going to work their way through the southern Pacific, so to speak, and work their way through these large island chains towards the Philippines. The first stop, Guadalcanal, an island in the Solomon Island chain. The Japanese were trying to build an airfield there, and that would really mess up life. So we wanted to capture the island before the airfield was completed. We invaded there in August of 1942. I would like to point out really quickly, the Japanese did not defend the beaches at Guadalcanal. So some of the lessons to be learned at places like Tarawa, we didn't learn them there because our men literally walked ashore and started trying to take the island, and they fought the Japanese once they got in the island, right, into the heart of it. It took months to actually secure Guadalcanal. The Japanese fought boldly to try and hold on to it. But as you can see there, by early 1943, we had secured it. And then we start jumping our way, right? Jumping our way through. The major Japanese naval base in the region was right here, Rabaul. Okay, right here was Rabaul. We skipped it. We went around it because taking these islands was kind of slow go. And MacArthur was afraid that the Navy was getting ahead of him, right? Because by early 1944, they were here, kind of getting ready to make this move, and he was only here, and he was afraid. So he's like, we're going to hurdle that. We're going to jump all the way to Haledonia here in New Guinea, and they did that. And then after they took out New Guinea and a few other quick operations, they were ready to go to the Philippines. So I just went through all of that. As I said, Guadalcanal, start moving up that chain, skip Rabaul, jump and get in position for the Philippines. The invasion of the Philippines took place in late 1944. In October of 1944, the United States Army and Navy and Marines were able to invade one of the smaller islands in the southern Philippines called Leyte. This is where Douglas MacArthur made his famous, he returned. He promised when he left that I shall return. And he famously did. He got in a landing craft after the beach was secure, and he returned to the Philippines the way his soldiers did. He walked through the water onto the beach. Very historic. They filmed it. He made a statement. Now, the Japanese, of course, were going to fight viciously to hold on to the Philippines. And their Navy had one last good fight left in them. Their Navy had been getting thoroughly beaten over the last few years, ever since Midway. And they were able to lure our major fleets away from the battle area to chase their fleet on a little trick. Over a series of several days, you're going to have battles on and off. They're generally called the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but it's actually several battles. When you add it up, it's the largest naval battle in history. More ships were involved, more modern ships were involved in this than any other battle in history. It was kind of the last gasp for the Japanese. They actually came close to wreaking havoc on the invasion because, like I said, the bulk of the American fleet went on a wild goose chase. And what was left behind was in no shape to stop the Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers. But miraculously, our fleet was able to hold off the Japanese, and the Japanese kind of thought they were facing more than they were, and they ended up running away. What's really important about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, though, all that aside, is it was the debut of organized kamikaze attacks. What are kamikazes? Kamikazes are suicide pilots who purposely ram their aircraft into ships, trying to assure heavy damage. It's basically a guided missile before we had guided missiles. The name kamikaze comes from Japanese history. In the 13th century, the Mongolians were attempting to invade Japan, and a massive typhoon destroyed the Mongolian invasion fleet and saved Japan from the Mongolians. And the Japanese called that storm Kamikaze, which in their language means divine wind. And so the Japanese called their suicide pilots Kamikaze because they viewed them as Japanese man-made divine wind. And so here you are. This is a pilot actually moments before he plows into the cruiser USS Columbia. The Columbia survived this attack, but of course this is humongous damage. These planes have a bomb strapped to them. They're not just a plane. They're a fully armed plane, so it's going to cause a massive explosion. The idea is, again, to guarantee a hit, to wreak humongous damage. This is actually at the Battle of St. Lo. This is actually at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I apologize. The carrier, the small escort carrier St. Lo, the ship sunk from this kamikaze attack. This actually took place at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This ship would sink at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was the first major ship sunk by a kamikaze. This is a Japanese bomber plowing into the USS Essex. This is a photo taken of the Essex from a nearby ship. This is the aircraft carrier USS Essex. So this is what this plane really did. So this plane damaged, went ahead and flew it on in. The Essex survived this attack. This is from the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This is a Japanese pilot making a run at the back end of the USS White Plains, another small escort carrier. The plane didn't make it. The plane exploded from anti-aircraft fire. We're not exactly 100% sure. Moments after this photo was taken and right before it hit the ship, debris from the explosion fell all over and rained across the deck, but the plane did not make an actual hit. This is the USS Intrepid about to be hit by a kamikaze. It did survive. The Intrepid actually survived 4 separate kamikaze attacks in World War II. It got hit by 2 planes in one day, actually, but still survived. It was a larger carrier than some of the others, like the St. Lo. It survived. Interesting personal note, my half-brother's father served on the Intrepid during the Vietnam War. So this ship not only survived the kamikazes of World War II, it went on to launch planes and missions in the Vietnam War. So I had a family member serve on it in the late 60s during the Vietnam War. But anyhow, so kamikazes were widespread. They started mainstream at the combat around Leyte Gulf. But they became a very common aspect of the Japanese war in the Pacific. The Japanese are getting desperate, and for those of you who think this is ridiculous, they basically took the method of they were losing no matter what. This might be the only way to inflict enough casualties to make America think twice. They were still going on the model of if we make them bleed enough, they'll back off. It's not worth it to them, right? They would much rather negotiate a peace deal than fight all the way to our doorstep against the people who are willing to do this. It didn't stop us, though. We took the Philippines. 80,000 Japanese died fighting for the Philippines. Less than 1,000 Japanese surrendered. Actually, many of them went into the hills. There were Japanese soldiers still fighting World War II in the 50s and even 60s in the Philippines. They never surrendered. We only eventually got some of them to surrender because we had a rough idea where they were hiding, and we had like their commanding officers from 15 years ago with a bullhorn yelling at them in the woods like, I'm ordering you to surrender. A bunch of Filipino civilians were killed in the Philippines, either through the various fighting, the bombing, or Japanese reprisal attacks. So the Pacific is getting very gruesome at this point. So both sides, we are knocking on the door. And this is what I wanted to show. So by late 1944, here's where we are, if you're wondering, okay, as we're stopping this video, okay? In the Pacific, we are here, okay? By the end of 1944, we've basically done this. We don't fully have the Philippines, but we're actually, yeah, let's erase that. We don't have all of the Philippines. We have most of the Philippines, okay? So there we are. All right. So that's where we stand at this point, all right, against the Japanese. In Europe, where we are leaving off at the end of D-Day, we're here in Normandy, and we're here in Italy. Okay, and the Russians are somewhere around here. Okay, that's it. We still got ways to go on both of them, and that is what we will finish off in our next video.